This video will provide instructions on how to complete the Interagency Agreement form and supporting documents that must be sent to DOE when working with DOE Laboratories. The audience for this video is budget and financial staff at non-Department of Energy agencies that are funding work at DOE Laboratories. FAR 17.5 provides specific instructions for interagency transactions. 2 points within this section that are commonly missed are the requirement to provide the Economy Act DNF to the servicing agency and to provide a non-competition statement when funding work at an FFRDC. The Office of Federal Procurement Policy, or OFPP, has also created a very detailed guide to interagency acquisitions. While it's not mandatory, and I would argue it is quite excessive, it is the most complete guide to the transactions. A link to the guidance is in the video description. This guidance is what created the Part A, Part B system and formed the basis for the Department of Treasury's 7600 forms. This page will describe the absolute minimum requirements needed to be on the IAA. First, there needs to be a form that describes the work, how to invoice, and provides the authority. This can be a DD 448 MEPR, a PRISM IAA, which is used by Homeland Security, NRC, Department of Interior, and many others, or a homegrown form like is used by NASA and the EPA. I have even seen memos used. A non-competition statement must be included somewhere in the package. It can be in the description in the IAA form, on the DNF, in the statement of work, or as a standalone statement. If the Economy Act is being used by the requesting agency, a DNF as described in FAR 17.502-2 must be provided to the servicing agency. If the requesting agency is not citing the Economy Act, then a DNF is not needed by DOE, even if the Act requires the requesting agency to prepare one. For example, the NRC uses the Department of Energy Reorganization Act as their authority to transfer the funds, so they do not need to prepare a DNF. Some work does require additional information and certifications, such as work for the intelligence community. These additional instructions should have been provided to the requesting agency when the work was being defined with the laboratory. If you suspect your work may require additional documentation, you should ask the technical point of contact at the requesting agency for any additional guidance they received from the laboratory. I will now discuss in detail the non-competition statement and the DNF. DOE has created template language to satisfy the requirement of FAR 17.503E. Using this language verbatim is not required, but it makes the search for the statement by the DOE signing official much easier. If you copy and paste a statement from the DOE order, you only need to check and remove the unneeded authority referenced. The requesting agency should have some documentation to support the statement in their file. While DOE will not ask for it, it is possible that a private entity will complain that the requesting agency is circumventing competition requirements by working directly with the laboratory instead of with their company. A minimum amount of documentation demonstrating that market research was done could make the response to that inquiry much easier for the requesting agency. The DNF can be quite long, or it can be a couple of paragraphs and fit onto one page. The exact requirements for details is entirely up to the requesting agency. DOE's only requirement for the DNF is that it cannot be wrong. DOE will not review the DNF for content other than to verify that the document is for the acquisition being requested. If there is a different IAA number, or a ceiling that has been exceeded, or a period of performance that expired, DOE will probably not accept the document. One of the FAR requirements for the DNF is to certify that the supplies or services cannot be obtained as conveniently or economically by contracting directly with a private source. This is half true because the supplies or services must not be available from the private source, regardless of convenience or economics, if the work is being funded at an FFRDC. A correct alternative would be for the requesting agency to make the non-competition statement from the previous page in the place of the language used in the FAR, as I believe this satisfies both requirements. Regarding the selection of at least one of the three circumstances, they all apply to work performed at DOE Laboratories. The requesting agency could mark all three and be correct in most cases. The laboratory contracts were all awarded prior to work being conceived for the requesting agency, and all laboratory contracts include work for others within their broad statements of work. The DOE is the only agency allowed to enter into contracts or authorize work under the contracts at DOE Laboratories. And the Atomic Energy Act specifically authorizes DOE Laboratories to perform work for other entities when no other private source are adequate to perform the work. The DNF sent to the DOE must be signed. The FAR only requires a signature from a contracting officer. However, many agency supplements pull this authority away from the CO. Almost all of DoD requires flag officers or their civilian equivalents to sign, for example. DOE will not verify authority, and the requesting agency is responsible for following their own regulations. Because of these high-level approval requirements, DNFs can sometimes be very hard to execute. Some agencies have found that creating a class DNF for work at DOE Laboratories to save time in the long run. By removing IAA references and specifying ceilings or a longer period of performances, the DNF could be used for more than the one IAA that is in process. Class DNFs can be very useful if the requesting agency sends a new basic IAA for each increment of funding. However, if the requesting agency simply adds funding via modification to an existing IAA, then DOE will not currently require a new amended DNF. I suspect that most contracting offices will require the DNF to be updated and approved at the appropriate level when modifications are issued. The requesting agency should refer back to their own internal policy and procedures. DOE does not sign the DNF. And lastly, if this is your first time, the DOE office accepting the IAA probably has sample DNFs that can be provided if you request them. Now I'm going to talk about completing the forms. Since the 7600 forms from Treasury are the most complete, and all agency forms tend to require less information than the 7600, I'm going to talk to questions that commonly cause confusion on that form. The 7600 is divided into two forms. The Part A is the general terms and conditions, and the Part B is the actual funding document. The Part A does not mean anything until the Part B is executed, since no work can be done until funding is being transferred. Because the Part A is not binding on its own, DOE does not require there to be a Part A. Many agencies find that they can include all of the information document Part A directly on the funding document, and I tend to agree with and appreciate that approach. On the other hand, the Part A may provide instructions for completing the Part B and could be helpful for programs that will have multiple different Part Bs during the course of the work. For example, the DoD and DOE have executed an umbrella Part A for all work performed at DOE for the Department of Defense. A copy of this Part A can be provided by the Office of the Secretary of Defense or the laboratory you are working with. Question 80 asks if this is an assisted acquisition. The FAR defines assisted acquisition in 17.5, but the answer for work at DOE Laboratories is not clear. DOE has taken the position that the work being done is not an assisted acquisition, even though the DOE is executing a contract action on behalf of the other agency. The reason is that the DOE is not performing any acquisition services beyond the contract modification. For example, DOE is not performing any acquisition planning, market research, synopsizing, or cost-price analysis. If this question is answered yes, the DOE office will either reject the document or will request some clarification on what the other agency expects the DOE to do for the action. This question is usually either left blank or answered no. Question A5 is for the period of performance. Since the Part A is only for generic T's and C's and is not binding without a Part B, I suggest making the POP as long as possible. Some agencies are going out 9 years for this question. Keep in mind the Part A may be modified in the future if needed. Question A8 determines payment terms. DOE defaults to reimbursement, and that is preferable. If the other agency insists on advance payments, DOE can accommodate, but because this will result in manual accounting entries, projects with advances tend to have more accounting errors. Question A9 asks for a breakout of costs. This is difficult to complete without a defined scope of work, which is not created until the Part B. This is usually left blank, but can be used to establish a ceiling for the project. The servicing agency authority in question A10B is the Atomic Energy Act, although the Economy Act can also be used. The last question I am covering in the Part A is question 19, which documents requesting agency clauses to be included in any resulting contract. This must be blank, as DOE will not add any other agency clauses to their laboratory contracts. One of the big benefits of using DOE Laboratories is that the other agency is able to piggyback on the DOE system. By adding additional clauses, that system loses its efficiency and would result in an increased cost for all laboratory customers, including the DOE. Therefore, DOE does not allow other clauses. A workaround for this is to add requirements to the project-specific statement of work. If the laboratory is willing to comply, then costs associated with those terms will be charged as direct costs to that one customer. The Part B is the funding document. It can either be the 7600B form from Treasury, a DD448, a PRISM form, or the agency-grown form. Even if the 7600A is used, the Part B does not have to be the 7600B. If a DoD office sends a DD 448, the existing Part A signed by the senior procurement executives will still apply. Question 26 is the funding modification summary. This is pretty easy for the basic, but gets confusing for modifications. Please be sure to fill this out correctly or the servicing agent will obligate funds. The period of performance can be confusing if the start date is prior to the signature dates. I suggest either leaving the start date blank or adding a note that the start date is the later of the start date listed in Block 27 or the date of last signature. Since the requesting agency cannot demand consideration for failing to satisfy the requirements within the period of performance, this field is more for tracking than a contractual obligation. The schedule in the statement of work is much more visible to the performers, where more effort should be expended. The funding information question is mostly self-explanatory. DOE normally provides this information during acceptance, but can pre-fill if needed by the requesting agency. All funds will be accepted as reimbursable. I will discuss the federal administration charge in a later slide. DOE will invoice monthly for all work, and the servicing agency officials in blocks 37 and 38 must be DOE staff, which is usually a contracting officer. Laboratory staff may not sign on behalf of the DOE. If you are not sure who this person is, leave the blocks blank. Laboratory staff can be specified in blocks 39 and 40. This is a bit of a repeat of the last slide, but it is my personal pet peeve, so you get to hear it twice. Do not send multiple Part Bs. DOE only needs one document obligating funds. The MIPR is a Part B. The PRISM form is a Part B. If a MIPR or PRISM IAA is sent, then a 7600B is not needed for DOE to obligate the funds, or vice versa. If the requesting agency must have DOE signatures on two different documents obligating the same funding, the form should be sent at the same time. If they are sent at different times and it is caught, many contracting officers, like me, will not sign the second form. Yes, it has happened on more than one occasion. If the duplication is not caught and doubly obligated on DOE's contract, I question whether DOE will be found to be the primary offender to the Anti-Deficiency Act. The 7600 requires DOE to sign 3 times. That's already excessive. Don't ask for more signatures than that. MOUs and MOAs are usually not needed if the IAA is complete. If you think one is needed, and there are certainly times when they are, be sure there is a good reason. Some agencies also request that DOE sign the IAA first. Most DOE sites will accommodate this, but it does require deviation from DOE's normal process. Most agencies will put an ink signature on the IAA and then obligate it in their accounting or contracting system after DOE returns the fully executed IAA. This way, errors can be easily corrected without requiring an amendment. Requiring DOE to sign first will usually add 1 to 5 days of processing time at DOE, in addition to the added processing time at the requesting agency. Many requesting agencies will require a complete cost or price analysis of work performed at the labs. The other agency should review and agree with all direct costs proposed by the laboratory. There is no value added by reviewing indirect costs, however. Since DOE contracts are all cost reimbursable, with no fee paid by the other agencies, there is no risk of indirect costs being inflated in order to collect higher fees. Also, the reason the lab is being tapped is because there is no other source for the work, meaning there is nowhere else to compare costs against. DOE is well aware of this limitation, which is why DOE is so closely integrated in the way the contractors budget and record costs. The other agencies should rely on DOE to ensure that the projects are budgeted and costed correctly. The DOE normally charge a federal administration cost, which was established by the National Defense Authorization Act of 1999, and it is not negotiable. However, the DOE CFO, as well as other acts of Congress, have waived this fee for specific programs. The requesting agency should know if they qualify for a waiver and should not expect the DOE to automatically waive this cost. Closeouts can be initiated by the requesting agency, but do not require the DOE to complete a contractor's release of claims. These usually do not make sense because the DOE cannot release the government because the DOE is the government. The release is meaningless as the original authority that transferred the work always, to the best of my knowledge, requires the requesting agency to reimburse all costs incurred by the servicing agency associated with the work, even if those costs are not identified until after the closeout. Timing is very laboratory dependent as the process and capabilities vary greatly from lab to lab. The requesting agency should follow up after 2 weeks if their funding has not been accepted. Work for the intelligence community always takes longer for DOE to accept due to DOE requirements for the work to be approved at DOE headquarters. The IC should work directly with DOE headquarters to make acceptance of their work as smooth as possible. The laboratory has requirements to comply with on their contract as well. If they were not able to meet those requirements before the funding is received, acceptance may be delayed. Be sure to keep your laboratory PI informed on funding progress so that they are ready to accept once the funding is sent. The contractors can begin work as soon as the DOE CO authorizes the work when the funding is accepted, but the actual obligation does not occur until the DOE contract is modified to add the funding. This usually occurs once a month, and the modification consolidates all work for other agencies into one action. Funds accepted after the cutoff will not be obligated until the following month. This cutoff is usually between the 10th and the 20th of the month. Do not expect DOE to obligate expiring funds instantaneously upon receipt. DOE will not accept expiring funds if the modification to the DOE contract cannot occur prior to the fund's expiration. Did I miss something? Or is your experience different from what I described? Ask in the comments to this video, or ask the DOE official responsible for oversight of the laboratory you are working with. Good luck!